He left a black credit card on her porch just before sunrise. Sliding it under a thin scrap of paper, he had folded into a note that said nothing at all. Only a clean line, where words might have been if courage and clarity had met in his hand. The card sat against the worn plank, like a dark coin dropped on snow. Foreign to the place, louder than any knock. A symbol that did not belong to fences mended by hand, to bread risen by lamplight, to the quiet of fields waiting for the day to open. When the Amish girl stepped out with a broom, she always used to sweep the porch before the birds finished their first chorus. She saw it before she felt the morning, and everything in her slowed the way it does when the mind recognizes a boundary has been crossed. She did not call for anyone. She did not step back. She looked at the card and at the blank slip, then at the road where dust lay undisturbed, and at the hedgerow where no leaf flickered. Her breath tightened, not from fear but from the sudden weight of meaning carried by a small, improper object. He had come in the hours when the community slept and left wealth condensed to a single gesture on a doorstep that had only ever known boots heavy with soil. The air smelled faintly of ash from the stove inside, and she understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives like a bell, that the choice was not about money, but about the line between two worlds and which one would be allowed into the other. She picked up the card the way someone picks up a thorn, careful not because it could pierce skin, but because it could pierce the story she lived inside. It was heavier than she expected, silky, too smooth, too deliberate. The black of it a studied silence, the raised letters cold against her fingers. The note underneath had no name, no plea, no promise, nothing for a person to argue with, only space for temptation to speak on its own. Behind her, the door hinges gave a small complaint as the house breathed with her movement, and she knew her mother would be stirring. Hum of morning tasks beginning, the rhythm that anchored everything they were. In that rhythm, there was no beat where a black credit card could fit. She imagined what would happen if she brought it inside, laid it on the kitchen table by the butter churn and the folded aprons. Even if no one saw, she would know it was there, the wrongness of it growing a root through the wood, and secrecy would creep in through the gap under the door like a draft that never left. The rule was simple and old. Things that bind you to the outside world bind you away from your people. To hold such a thing was to hold a tether to a promise that always began with ease and ended with loss. So the decision arrived not as argument, but as obedience to the life she had vowed. She turned, walked to the woodpile stacked beneath the tin-scaped eave, took 3 brittle twigs from the top, where the sun had cured them, and set them in the old iron pan kept for ash, and scraps the stove would not take. She did not make a ceremony of it, because ceremonies give pride a stage, and this was not about pride. It was about keeping quiet things quiet. With a practiced thumb and steel, she coaxed a spark, caught it in the curled belly of a leaf, lifted it to the twigs, and watched a small, efficient flame take its breath. She held the black card and the blank note together for a moment, not to reconsider, but to close the loop between what had entered and what must now leave. Then she placed both in the flame. The note went first, eager to vanish, a quick surrender. The card resisted like a lie, bending, blistering, refusing to accept the verdict, its edges bowing with an ugly sheen as heat chewed through whatever promise it had been made to carry. She did not flinch when the plastic smell rose sharp as reproach. She watched until it soured and collapsed into a warped ruin, and then into a curl of dark that could no longer claim a name. Only when it was unrecognizable did she nudge the remains deeper into the ash, smothered them, and stood still in the kind of silence that has edges. On the road beyond the hedgerow, a truck idled far off, invisible but present in the faint tremor underfoot, like a thought someone was trying not to think. He was there, or near enough to count as there, the one who had left the card, watching to see if the world he had reached for would reach back. He had reasons that made sense in another language, reasons shaped by ledgers and timelines, by the quick arithmetic of gifts that fix problems, and by access, by a life where obstacles moved when money leaned its shoulder. In that life, the black card was not a vulgarity but a standard tool, a key ring to any door. He had not expected the door to burn the key. Now the faint column of smoke rising from behind the porch rail told him more than words would have told. He felt the foolishness of his own certainty. The kind that sneaks in when a man believes he can bend an old story with a new gadget. He tapped the wheel twice, 3 times, as if the rubber could absorb his embarrassment, and told himself that the gesture had at least delivered a message. He was there, he cared. He would help. But the message she sent back spoke in a grammar he would have to learn or leave. Some offers are not offers. They are trespasses. Inside the house, her father's boots hit the floor with that particular finality that announces the day has truly started. The girl swept the pan, stirred the ash, and took the iron outside to the barrel where they kept cooled cinders for the garden soil. She did not hide what she had done and did not announce it, either. She simply acted as a person does who has chosen and is now moving into the next moment. When her mother asked if there was extra smoke, she answered that a piece of trash had blown onto the porch during the night, and she had burned it because no one wanted plastics or strange metals in the bin that would be used for anything near the kitchen. The explanation was not a lie because it was not for her mother's benefit. It was a way to tidy the air, to keep anxiety from looking for hooks. The truth sat in her chest like a weighted spool, pulling thread through, stitching her to the decision. Outside, the light widened, and roosters on neighboring farms began their uneven commentary. She took the broom again and cleared the last mess of ash from the plank where the card had looked like a bruise. There was nothing left to see. That was the point. By mid-morning, the community road had filled with the wheels and voices that make a place feel real. Wagons rattling, children chasing the slow edges of chores, elders examining the sky as if it were a ledger that could be read and balanced. The girl went to the wash line with a basket of clothing, clipped sleeves and collars into the sun, and let ordinary motions reclaim the space that had been disrupted. Yet as cloth flapped and water dripped, she could not avoid the way the mind keeps returning to the moment a boundary was tested. She was not angry at him. Anger would have made the story about a contest. She was not flattered. Flattery would have made it flirtation. She felt, instead, a deep steadiness mixed with the ache that always attends a clean refusal, because refusal acknowledges that something was indeed offered. The ache was proof she was human. The steadiness was proof she belonged. When a neighbor paused at the fence to talk about the price of hay and the rumor of a new piece of land coming up for lease, she listened, asked questions, nodded in the right places. All the while, a picture threaded the back of her mind, the card's black surface bulging in the heat, a counterfeit moon losing its shine. He drove from the edge of fields into town, carrying with him the unsettled feeling of a plan dismantled by a gesture so simple it exposed the plan's arrogance. He had told himself that he would not force, that he would not demand, that he would not make a spectacle. He had left the card because it felt like leaving options, and men like him worship options because options mean escape lanes, and escape lanes are a kind of power. But her answer said, power is not what you think it is. Power is the ability to stay inside a promise when every easy exit calls your name. He parked 2 blocks from the supply store, where he usually handled farm deliveries, stared at his hands on the wheel, and tried to remember when he had last felt so young in the way a man feels when he realizes another person lives by a code he does not yet understand. He imagined walking back to the porch to apologize, then imagined how foolish that would be. And then, because men who build tend to default to building again, he began looking for another approach that would not insult what had been defended. If he could not buy a door, could he widen a path? If he could not widen a path, could he at least learn to walk the narrow one without stomping? Rumors in a small place flare up like brush if given wind, but the girl had given them no wind. She had burned the evidence, and the evidence had told the only audience that mattered, her own heart. Still, an older aunt noticed a new seriousness in the way the girl tied her kerchief, a tiny gravity added to motions that had always been precise. Over lunch, the aunt mentioned the outside man, who sometimes came by with equipment parts, how he looked like someone who owned his time instead of trading it, how the world beyond their boundary always sends these emissaries with chins lifted and sleeves rolled, and how a person must keep her eyes where her feet are. The girl agreed, not as rehearsal but as conviction, remembering flame in the pan and the smell that had crawled up the walls of morning. Later, while she helped a neighbor with a baby who refused to sleep, she held the child close and felt the way soft weight tethers a person to what is immediate and right. A future imagined by someone else is only ever a picture. A child breathing against your collarbone is a vow you can feel. She stroked the baby's hair and let the ache inside her come and go like a tide that knows its limits. In the evening, after chores drew down and lamps painted clean circles on wooden tables, her father read a passage about keeping oneself unspotted from the world. The words were not a weapon, not a coded reproach, but the ordinary bread of their life. She listened as she always did, but now the text found new ground because the day had plowed it. She thought about spots and about the way a black card wants to make a mark you cannot see until the pattern of your days is stained and you do not remember what clean looked like. She understood that her decision had not only been for her. Decisions never are. They carve grooves that others use without knowing who cut them. She wondered if the man who had left the card would understand, if he would read her answer as contempt or as invitation to meet them on their terms. She hoped for the latter, not because she wanted anything from him, but because hope is part of stewardship. Hope tends to the possibility that a person from elsewhere can learn to speak with the community's mouth without swallowing it. Before she slept, she stepped out once more to the porch, where the night had laid its cool hand on the boards. She set her palm to the plank where the card had rested, as if feeling for any residue of a story that might still be clinging. There was none, only the clean hardness of wood and the faint scent of ash caught somewhere in the grain. She whispered nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The stars above were plentiful and indifferent, which is a comfort if you know how to accept it. The world is vast, your choice is small, and yet those small choices are the only place where vastness becomes personal. She went inside, shut the door with the softness her mother prized, and lay down to sleep like a person who has put a stone back exactly where it belongs along the edge of a field. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, tires hummed then faded. Somewhere between here and town, a man sat in a rented room and stared at a cup of coffee gone cold, practicing the art of not reaching for easy tools. The next morning promised to look like any other to anyone who had not been standing on that porch when day first woke. But for the girl it carried a different brightness, not the brightness of novelty, but the brightness of resolve polished by use. She rose, dressed, braided her hair with steady hands, and went to the porch with her broom. She swept, not to erase something, but to honor what had been guarded. The road waited, as roads do, patient, willing to carry whatever the day chose to send. She understood that a refusal is not the end of a story. A refusal redraws the map, so the journey can be taken without getting lost. She also understood that her act would invite new tests, subtle ones, disguised as kindness, shaped like help. The outside is clever. It learns your language and tries to speak it back to you with a slight slant. She would have to listen for slants. She would have to keep the core of her world from being traded for the edges of someone else's. She did not fear that work. It was the same work as milking at dawn and stacking wood for winter and holding her tongue when words would only show off. It was the work of belonging. He, for his part, woke with a plan gentler than the one that had embarrassed him. He would come in daylight. He would not leave anything that burned. He would bring his hands, and whatever those hands could do that did not violate. He would ask what needed fixing that did not require a card, and he would not take offense if the answer was nothing. He would learn to wait, and in the waiting, he would learn whether his interest was a wish to possess or a desire to honor. The difference was a cliff edge. Men talk about risk as if it is a hill to be climbed and conquered. Sometimes risk is simply staying at the base and refusing to build a staircase where no staircase belongs. As he shaved, he thought about the fire he had not seen but had felt. He respected it, not as an opponent, but as a boundary line that made the ground beyond it more meaningful if he was ever allowed to step there. He did not know if he would be. For once, not knowing felt like a discipline he needed. By the end of that day, nothing dramatic had occurred. No one had shouted. No one had pointed. The fields went on greening. The laundry dried. Meals were cooked and dishes washed and clocks wound. Yet a quiet pivot had taken place. The kind people do not notice until they look back and see that the road bent slightly here. The Amish girl had taken a test and answered with a match. The outsider had offered a shortcut and been taught the long way. Both had moved in their own spheres, toward a place where any next step would matter more, because it would be taken with the knowledge that shortcuts cost more than they advertise. The flame that had eaten the black card had not been for spectacle or pride or defiance. It had been for alignment. Under the simple roof of a simple house, alignment now held like a beam set true, ready to bear whatever weight the story would lay upon it. The morning after she burned the evidence, the farm woke with the modest certainty of chores, and yet beneath that ordinary march lay the knowledge that a boundary had been drawn cleanly enough to hear it hum. She stepped into work as a person steps into a well-made pair of boots, nothing to prove, everything to carry, aware that even routine can be a declaration. She filled pails, skimmed cream, and moved through the kitchen with the unflashy grace learned from years of matching motion to purpose. She said little because little needed to be said. The house spoke in the quiet clinks of enamel bowls and the soft knock of wooden drawers, and those sounds were the measure of a day aligned. Outside, the fields lay as honest as ledger lines, rows waiting for hands and weather to decide their fate, and a breeze went running its palm over the corn in a way that made even worry kneel for a moment and listen. She kept the porch in view without staring at it, the way a watchman keeps the gate inside the angle of an eye, not from fear that something would return, but because discipline means remembering where to look even when nothing is happening. She did not expect him to come, not so soon, not after the answer she had sent in smoke, and yet she understood that a story rarely ends at the first refusal. It takes the refusal as an honest beginning, and then asks everyone involved what they meant by it. He drove back as the sun cleared the roofs in town and put light like a page under the day's words, and he parked in a place where engines were not supposed to linger, not out of defiance, but because he did not yet know the right place to stop. He left the keys, took a breath to quiet the habit of arriving with noise, and walked the lane as if it belonged to the earth and not to him, boots down slow, eyes level, hands open. He carried no bag and wore no gesture that could be mistaken for a transaction. He had learned at least that much. He stopped by the fence and waited until someone inside the work of the yard looked up. Her father was first, gaze steady beneath the brim, not a challenge but a measurement. Men who have built and mended their own world do not glare, they weigh. The outsider spoke with the kind of respect a person uses when he wants his words to fit through another man's door without banging their shoulders. He said he had equipment knowledge and two good hands, that he had heard the wind had taken shingles from more than one roof after last week's storm, that a neighbor had mentioned a stubborn belt on a thresher, and that he would be grateful to be told if there was any task that could use an extra pair of arms, but no extra opinions. The father said nothing for a breath, then two, then nodded once, the nod of a man who has chosen to test without announcing it. There's a hinge on the west barn door that groans like a man with a stone in his shoe, he said. It needs setting true. The outsider thanked him and waited for the rest, which came as a rule rather than a courtesy. No pay, no talk. Keep your phone put away. Eat when we eat or not at all. And do not decide to solve problems that were not handed to you. These were not hostile conditions. They were the scaffolding that allows strangers to stand near without collapsing the frame. The hinge turned out to be the kind of problem that reveals whether a man knows how to think with his hands. The screws were old and chewed, the wood swollen at the cut from years of damp, the door heavy with the stubbornness of a thing that has been used wrong for too long. He fetched a brace, not a modern ratchet, because modern tool chatter would have been louder than the work itself, and he set his shoulder under the plank to take weight while the father loosened the top hangers. They said only the number of words needed to keep the door from falling. When the bottom hinge came free, the outsider did not hold it up to the light and talk about misalignment as if he had discovered geometry. He took a file from his pocket and dressed the metal until its face was clean enough to sit flush again, then cut a shallow backer from scrap, set new pilot holes with care, and refused the temptation to use long fasteners that would split the grain just to speed the job. When they lifted the door back onto the pins, the wood settled without complaint, the kind of surrender that means you have matched effort to truth. The father opened and closed the door twice, listening with his hands, then let it swing one more time, not because he doubted the work, but because satisfaction needs one quiet moment to land. He glanced at the outsider with a look that was not warmth yet and not suspicion either. It was the look men offer each other when the job in front of them has replaced the idea they had about the man beside them. Work became their language for the rest of the morning. A loose slat on the corral asked to be read and answered, and they read it by checking first the posts, because a slat never fails alone. A dull blade on the hay knife asked not for a speech about efficiency, but for a stone and a patient wrist. A rain barrel that wandered on its cinder block legs wanted the simple dignity of a level. None of it was dramatic enough to carry a story anywhere else, but within the fence it was the type of courage that counts. Showing up in daylight, moving with care through a world that is not yours, and refusing to translate respect into money. The girl passed with baskets and pails, nodding when paths crossed, face calm, gaze neither inviting nor dismissing. She did not make him part of her morning. She made him part of the fence line, a thing noticed because it exists and assessed because it affects how the day moves or does not. Once, when he carried a crate of bolts from the workshop to the barn, she stepped aside on the path, but did not widen the space more than courtesy required. He felt the boundary as something tangible, like heat from a stove you do not touch because you can sense both its use and its consequences. Word of his presence reached the edges quickly, as it always does where distances are short and attention is a shared asset. A buggy slowed at the lane and rolled on. A pair of boys, more curiosity than caution, took the long way around the field to see if there was anything worth telling later, and went home disappointed because the scene offered only men working and a gait that no longer dragged. An elder, walking with the particular pace of someone who has buried both parents and most of his pride, stopped by mid-afternoon and stood to the side without stepping into the conversation. He did not ask who the outsider was. He asked the father if the hinge sang or sulked now. When told the matter was finished in quiet, he nodded, looked once at the outsider in a way that suggested a ledger in his head had received an entry, and moved on. No one spoke the word welcome. Welcome is for guests. This was not hospitality. It was apprenticeship in the art of not doing harm. At noon, the bell in her mother's voice cut the air the way a knife finds the seam in a roast, and they went into the shade near the pump, where plates of bread and slices of cheese and thick coins of tomato waited with the patient generosity of food that owes nothing to packaging. The outsider did not sit until shown a place on the bench and where a man can leave easily if the air turns. He removed his hat, set it brim down because that's the only upright way to leave a hat, and he left his phone in the truck where it had spent the morning cooling on the passenger seat, like a habit put in time out. They ate without performance, and when he tried to hand the father a jar of cold water first, the father pushed it toward the girl, because here water passes to the one who poured it last, and if you forget that you have forgotten the person who keeps the table moving. When a fly pestered the board, the mother did not swat hard as if to make a point about cleanliness. She lifted her napkin and redirected the intruder without violence, and he noticed the way even irritation was taught to take a small, honorable path. Talk stayed near the ground. Rain that had been and that might come. A calf that would not stay where a calf should. A rumor that the auction of a broken baler might be worth the trip if the cylinder could be repaired. He said little because listening was the only currency that would not be refused. In the afternoon, the work turned consequential. A belt on the thresher had laughed at 3 men the previous week and cut 1 knuckle for its trouble. The outsider asked permission to look not only at the belt, but at the pulleys that held it in their logic. He traced their line the way a man traces a thought to its source, found a hairline in a bracket nobody loved, and showed the father without presenting the discovery like a trophy. They took the assembly down, laid it on a blanket, so the earth would not add grit to a part that would be asked to move cleanly, and they cleaned and squared and trued until metal sat to metal like a handshake that meant something. When the belt went back and the flywheel spun with the kind of new confidence that lacks noise, the father let the outsider tighten the last bolt, a gift small enough to be missed by anyone who has never waited for trust to arrive molecule by molecule. The girl, passing with a sack of feed, paused a heartbeat to listen to the soft, correct sound of a machine that had been taught to behave again. She did not praise. Praise would have been a step toward a debt she did not intend to owe. She noted the work as she would note clean lines of laundry, the marker of a house run properly. After the tools were wiped and put back in their places, because putting a tool in the wrong place is a kind of lie that steals time from the next person. He asked if there was anything else that could rightly carry him through the rest of the daylight. The father glanced toward the lane where the fence sagged after the last thaw had moved the posts, and the outsider followed the glance. They worked there until the sky took on the thin silver that comes before the first colors of evening, resetting the corner so it would hold the run tight, tamping the fill with rhythm enough to let the earth settle willingly around the wood. They said almost nothing. They did the kind of math you do with shovels and tampers and the chalk of sweat. When it was done, the father breathed the small, satisfied breath of a man who knows a cow will think twice before testing that corner, and he lifted his chin a fraction in the direction of the house. That was dismissal without dismissal. The outsider gathered himself with that care a person takes when he wants to leave a place in the same or better order than he found it, and he walked back down the lane with his hat in his hand and the sun on the brim. On the porch, the girl stood with a basket of folded shirts and watched him go without letting curiosity break the straightness of her posture. She did not want his story. She wanted his choices, and choices are only readable across time. The char mark where the iron pan had rested the day before had disappeared into the grain, but in her memory it still offered its hard lesson. A life is guarded not by a single flame, but by many small fires tended often. She wondered if he understood that he had been measured all day not by what he could fix, but by what he would refrain from touching. There's a kind of strength that overreaches in the name of help. She had no use for that. She had seen him keep his hands to the task and his mind out of their house. She acknowledged, privately, that this was the only bridge that could ever have a chance of bearing weight, one built without nails that glitter. Twilight assembled itself from the edges inward, and with it the community's natural audits began. Her father spoke one sentence at the table about the work completed, naming the tasks rather than the man, the way a pastor gives thanks for rain and not for clouds. An aunt asked whether any outside tools had been used, and her mother answered that the brace had belonged to the grandfather and the stone to the kitchen drawer. Someone else wondered if the thresher would hold under load, and the father said the pulleys had been trued and the bracket made honest. Words that meant more than they said, because honesty is both a moral and a mechanical virtue in places where the same hands handle scripture and steel. No one asked if the outsider would return, because asking would have made a path where none had been invited. Yet the unasked question lived in the spaces between comments, and the girl felt it like a draft you decide to ignore because you are not the one who put the window there. He drove to the edge of town with the tiredness that feels like a payment made in the right currency. Arms heavy, back satisfied, a thin smear of dirt still on his forearm where he had not noticed he'd touched his face. He did not celebrate or congratulate himself, because pride after a decent day's work tastes like sugar on bread meant to be plain. He found a diner where the coffee poured steady and the talk was local, sat in a back booth, and kept his gaze where his cup was, not on the door. He let the day replay, not in highlights, but in the sequence of motions that had added up to something like a permission to try again. He thought about the burned card and felt grateful for that fire in a way that surprised him. Without it, he would have gone on imagining that kindness starts with a swipe. He thought about the father's single nod, and the elder's quiet ledger, and the girl's deliberate sidesteps that had the dignity of a dance without music. He thought about how long it takes to learn a language when you have spent years assuming that volume is fluency. He decided, without writing it down because some promises need to live closer to the bone, that he would return only to carry weight, and that if ever he forgot that rule, he would rewrite the day's lesson with a sharper pen. Night took the farm and tucked it in the way night does when a house has done its work. The girl laid down with the clean fatigue of a person who has made good choices and paid their price up front, eyes closing on the image of a hinge that no longer complained and a fence that would stand the kind of tests weather loves to give. She did not permit herself a story where the outsider's presence became a flame to warm hands at in secret. If the story was to go anywhere worth going, it would walk, and it would walk in public, and it would walk at the community's pace. She asked, quietly and without drama, for the sturdiness to hold that line tomorrow and the day after that, and for the grace to see clearly the difference between help that arrives to serve and help that arrives to claim. In the other bed, her mother breathed evenly, At the window, the curtains lifted and fell like a chest. Somewhere up the road, a dog gave one uninterested bark and went back to sleep. Whatever came next would have to pass through this kind of night to be admitted. That, more than anything, was her assurance that their world could be approached without being undone, and that if the man returned, he would return to a place that could teach him what he could not buy. The third morning came with a low mist that unrolled across the pasture like cloth, softening edges, hush in the hedgerows, a moisture that made sounds travel shorter distances and made everyone rely more on what they could feel than on what they could see. The girl woke into that gray and stepped into work with her usual economy, measuring the day by the weight of pails and the angle of her shadow on the porch boards. She did not look for him and did not arrange herself to avoid him. The rule she kept was simpler than strategy: do the next right task. Yet the morning carried the sense of a test that no one had agreed to but everyone recognized. The way a classroom senses a surprise quiz when the teacher closes the door softly. The father's eyes moved less than usual but saw more. The mother set bread to rise with a deliberate calm, and the wind lifted from the east, where storms make their first announcements. When the outsider turned in from a lane, truck left where it would not offend, hat in his hand until someone nodded that a head could be covered again on account of the chill. He walked as he had learned to walk there, forward without hurry, attentive without needling, ready without preamble. He had brought nothing but the memory of how yesterday had been accepted, and the understanding that acceptance is not a bank account you can draw on. It is a well you approach with humility, and hope there is enough water for your need. By mid-morning the mist had burned off into a thin brightness that made metal talkative, and the day offered work that was honest but unremarkable until the weather turned its face. The sky went the color of pewter under ash. Wind shouldered the trees from the west, and a fine grit began to ride the air the way a rumor rides conversation. Across the back lot, the tarp over the seed wagon popped its lashes free and snapped like a wet flag, and before anyone could catch it, the wind grabbed the canvas and flung it toward the creek bank as if it had a grudge. At the same time, the mare in the small pen began to circle with that wildness horses keep in a locked room, nostrils flared, whites showing, hoofs striking the packed dirt, testing the gait that had only just yesterday been trued. The father moved first for the mare, because a panicked horse can turn a fence into kindling. The girl ran for the seed wagon to keep feed from going damp and useless, and the outsider stood for one perfect heartbeat in the middle of that split path, and chose to divide himself the way a good hinge divides weight. He shouted no orders, because here shouting is reserved for fire and children in the lane. He ran to the wagon's tongue, drove a stake deeper with a mallet he lifted from habit more than thought, anchored the frame so the gale could not walk the wheels, then stripped his jacket, wrapped it twice around his wrist, and caught the slashing edge of the tarp as if catching a live thing that wanted to bite. The canvas fought, hands burned through damp and grit, but he found the eyelets, found the cord, and with the girl mirroring his motions across the bed, they stitched the cover back down in a series of quick, ugly knots that had no beauty except function. When the last corner cinched, he felt the wind step back, robbed of the leverage it had taken for granted, and he looked across at the girl without triumph, only confirmation that a small battle had been fought on the right field. At the pen the mare still turned, haunches slick with the first damp, testing the gait with the kind of calculation fear uses when it wants to be justified. The father kept his body low, hands out, voice low and even, the sound men use to convince prey animals that they are weather and not wolves. The outsider approached without cutting the circle, without making the horse reckon with two men at once. He came to the hinge post the way a doctor comes to a broken finger, respecting pain, prepared for temper, and he slid the latch pin up a breath to free the metal that had begun to bind when wind slammed the rail. The gate eased, the mare's circle widened into thought, and the father stepped into that thought with a halter held like a suggestion, not a demand. When the halter settled and the mare's breath slowed to a decision instead of a panic, the father looked once at the outsider and gave him not a nod this time, but a thin half-smile that said, "Not you are one of us, but you are not making us less ourselves by being here." In a place like this, that is higher praise than a welcome banner. The storm spent itself on the other side of noon, leaving that washed air that makes sound travel farther and choices seem clearer. The mother brought out plates because hands that hold plates can't argue, and the elder who had passed the day before returned with the kind of timing that suggests a man listens to wind as much as to clocks. He set himself just outside the circle of work and attention and asked no questions that would put anyone on a witness stand. He watched the mare flick her ears, as if testing the edges of fear for holes. He watched the girl coil the spare rope properly, because coiled wrong it turns into a trap. He watched the outsider, not the way people watch a show, but the way carpenters watch a beam that has just been set, to see if it will hold when the house takes its first heavy weather. When the elder finished a slow drink of water, he said that a fence that stays straight in a wind is a sermon anyone can understand, and he said it in the general, as if talking about geometry. No one corrected him. In the general is where communities protect the personal. Afternoon brought a different test, smaller in scale but sharper in meaning. The boy from the next farm, shoulders up near his ears from the self-consciousness of 13, came dragging a busted wheelbarrow whose tray had split along the seam where rust and time go to church together. He had been told he could ask for the father's file if he asked properly, and he had practiced the asking all the way down the lane. When he arrived and saw the outsider near the workshop door, he paused, the way a boy pauses when an audience appears where he had hoped for none. The outsider stepped back, let the boy's eyes find the father first, and kept his hands visible, but still. The father listened to the stammered request, put the file in the boy's palm with care enough to make the tool feel like responsibility, then looked at the outsider and said, as if assigning a chore without attaching a chain, walk him through how a seam is trued and how a patch is made to tell the truth. The outsider crouched beside the barrow and asked the boy where the holes would like to be. The boy blinked and then, after a second, pointed to clean metal instead of thin scab. They squared the edge gently, cut a rectangle from an old sign that had once warned about a dog that slept most of its days anyway, and the outsider let the boy strike the first rivet, because first strikes matter when you are making a thing your own. The girl watched from the porch, not the repair itself, but the way the outsider shrank himself so the boy could grow. It is a particular kind of skill to refuse the spotlight when you are the tallest person in the room. She noted it and put it on the same shelf in her mind, where she kept the memory of the hinge now quiet and the belt now true. When evening spread its clean linen over the fields, the outsider washed his hands at the pump, the kind of washing men do when they know they will still smell like the day, no matter how long they scrub. He did not linger when the light went long. He did not ask for news about tomorrow. He thanked the Father for the work with the few words a mouth ought to spend on gratitude, when the debt is not to a favor, but to the chance to be useful. The Father said that a man who puts things back where he found them is a man you can trust to return if he says he will. The girl stood in the doorway, presence quiet as furniture, and let that exchange pass through her without comment. She was beginning to understand that whatever this was becoming, it would not be decided by one moment's heat, but by a line of days kept plumb. The burned card still lived in the ledger as the refusal that made the rest possible. Nothing since it contradicted it, and nothing since it tried to pretend it had not happened. That, more than anything, allowed her to sleep that night with the windows open and the curtains breathing slow, the house holding its own story straight, while another story asked at the edge to be let in carefully, if at all. The fourth day began with the sound of wagon wheels on the gravel road, a slow and steady rhythm that belonged to neighbors on their way to trade eggs for flour or to fetch feed before the mill closed early for inspection. The sun came up clear, with that pale gold light that makes every shadow seem honest, and the air carried the faint sweetness of clover just beginning to bloom. The girl moved through her morning as she always did, fetching water, feeding hens, folding the last of the laundry before the wind picked up. Yet there was a quiet awareness in her body that the pattern of these days had shifted. The outsider had not missed a morning since the hinge, and each time he came, he arrived with empty hands and left with the smell of work in his clothes. It was not yet routine, but it had become a rhythm, and rhythms in a place like this are treated with care because they have the power to settle or to unsettle. She did not look for him. She simply lived in the knowledge that if he came, his footsteps would be measured and his work would be the kind that leaves nothing out of place. He appeared not long after the rooster's second call, carrying nothing but a coil of rope over one shoulder and the dust of the road on his boots. The father met him at the edge of the yard, the way two men meet when they've already spoken with their hands more than with their mouths. Today's work was different, less repair, more preparation. A section of the pasture fence needed reinforcing before the cattle were moved closer for season, and the job required someone willing to spend hours in the sun, driving posts and stretching wire without complaint. The outsider listened to the plan without interruption, nodded once, and set himself to the task as if it had always been his. They worked in a line, the father setting the post straight, the outsider tamping the earth hard around them, and the girl passing tools between them when needed, her movements quiet but precise. It was the kind of work that eats the morning whole, and yet none of them treated the hours as a burden. Each strike of the post driver, each pull on the wire, was part of a conversation without words, a conversation about trust that neither side had yet declared but both were beginning to feel. By midday the fence stood tight and clean, the wire catching the light in neat, unbroken lines, and the father stepped back with the rare ease of a man satisfied before the job was even tested. They washed at the pump, the outsider letting the cold water run over his wrists and into his palms before wiping his face with a cloth he kept folded in his pocket. Lunch was eaten under the oak at the side of the house, where the shade was deep and the grass kept the ground cool. They spoke little, but the silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a bench they all sat on, facing the same way. The girl watched the outsider's manner, how he set his cup down carefully, how he waited for others to finish before reaching for more bread, how his eyes followed the sound of a colt calling in the far pasture as if he understood that everything here was connected. She did not smile, but she felt a small shift inside, a recognition that his presence no longer scraped against the grain of their life the way it had on the morning of the black card. When the meal ended, he did not linger in the shade. He rose, thanked her mother for the food in a voice low enough to be respectful but clear enough to be heard, and turned back to the field without being told. The afternoon was for tightening the gate at the pasture entrance and digging a small trench where rainwater had been pooling near the barn wall. It was slower work, the kind that rewards patience more than strength, and he gave it both. By the time the sun began to slope, the trench ran clean, the gate closed without sagging, and the ground around the barn would stay dry through the next storm. As he put the tools away, he glanced once at the porch, not to seek approval, but to acknowledge the house as part of the ground he had worked on. The girl was there, setting a jar of milk in the shade to cool before supper. Their eyes met for a moment, not as strangers or as friends, but as two people who had seen enough of each other's choices to know they were not made carelessly. When he left that evening, the dust of the road rose behind him in the soft light, curling back over the fence they had set that morning. The girl stood for a while watching the line of wire disappear into the distance, straight and unyielding, thinking how much it resembled the line she had drawn the day she burned the card. Only now, she saw that some lines were not just for keeping things out. They were also for keeping what mattered in. The real test was knowing which was which, and she sensed that before this was over, both of them would have to answer that question without words. The fifth day brought a heat that settled over the farm before the sun had fully cleared the tops of the trees, the kind of heavy air that made every movement deliberate and every sound feel slower. The girl began her morning with sleeves rolled higher than usual, hair braided tighter so the wind, or lack of it, would not work it loose. Chores stretched longer in the heat, yet the rhythm of work remained unbroken. She had come to expect that the outsider would arrive, but still she kept her back to the lane, never letting expectation turn into invitation. When he did appear, the same coil of rope slung over his shoulder, dust clinging to his boots, he paused at the fence as if waiting for the day itself to decide if he belonged in it. The father gave him the smallest tilt of the head, enough to open the gate, and without another word the man stepped into the day's work. The task was one of the harder ones. A section of the roof on the equipment shed had begun to loosen under the strain of last winter's snow, and the wind from the last storm had teased a corner of tin up just enough to let rain slip under. In their way of living, repairs to a roof were never postponed. Water is patient and relentless, and to leave it an opening is to invite it to eat through everything. The outsider followed the father to the shed, eyes scanning the structure, not like a man looking for a problem to solve, but like one measuring the safest way to move inside someone else's order. The girl brought them a wooden ladder, the same one her grandfather had made decades before, and watched as they worked in quiet, one holding the metal down while the other replaced nails with screws that would grip through wind and time. The heat pressed against them, sweat rolling into the grain of the wood beneath their hands, but neither hurried. They worked with the kind of care that outlasts the discomfort of a hot day, their movements slow, precise, and without waste. By midday, the sun was a weight on the back of every neck, and the shed's roof lay smooth and sealed, ready for the next season. They washed their hands at the pump, the water running warm at first, then cooling from deeper in the well. Lunch was taken inside that day to escape the glare, and the outsider kept his seat near the end of the table, speaking only when addressed. The girl noticed the way he observed the room, not with hunger or with judgment, but with a kind of quiet study, as though learning a language by ear. He asked the father, not her, if there was anything to be done before the day's light faded, and when told about the pile of stones that needed clearing from the far field before plowing, he nodded and rose without hesitation. She saw him in the distance through the afternoon, carrying stone after stone to the edge of the field, his back bent under the work, his pace steady even as the sun drained the color from the horizon. When he returned to the yard at day's end, his shirt was dusted white with dried sweat and grit, and his hands were marked with the day's labor. He left the tools clean and stacked, gave a brief word of thanks, and made for the lane without turning toward the porch. The girl, standing in the doorway with the last of the laundry in her arms, watched him go, her expression unreadable, but her thoughts restless. She had burned the black card because it did not belong here, because it had spoken in a language she refused to let into her world. Yet in these days since, he had been speaking another language entirely, not with words, but with work, restraint, and the refusal to cross the line she had drawn. She did not know if it would change anything, or if it was meant to. All she knew was that each day he returned, he left nothing behind but the evidence of things made better, and for now, that was the only kind of offering she would not burn. The sixth day did not announce itself with gentleness. It arrived with a sky the color of hammered tin and a wind that pushed at the hedgerows as if impatient with anything that stood in its path. The farm was already up to meet it, tools set by the door, boots lined like small vows on the porch, and the girl moved among the morning's duties with the quiet firmness of someone who knows that weather and work both answer only to steadiness. There was more to this day than chores. The neighbor's old barn, leaning for years like a tired man, had been judged unfit to face another season. The community would raise a new frame on the same footprint before the corn silks browned. Such work was a liturgy of hands and time, men measuring and cutting, boys carrying pegs and water, women sitting a table that carried half the weight with bread alone. The father had spoken the night before of the plan and of the need for shoulders that could carry without comment. The outsider heard, not because anyone had sought him out, but because news travels in places where fences are low and eyes are good. He came, as he had each day, without ornament or excuse, and he took his place at the edge of the yard waiting for the father's nod that would admit him to the labor, but not to anything that did not belong to him. By mid-morning the skeletal rafters were up, and the timbers at the corners stood like sentences that would soon be made into a paragraph. The outsider moved as he had learned to move here, bounded by rules, governed by the task in front of him, speaking only when words were truly a tool. He carried beams with men who did not wear his clothes or keep his calendar, and found that rhythm has a way of shortening distances between people when language would only lengthen them. The girl watched the work from the margin of the yard as she carried pitchers and kept the bench under the maple supplied with what men forget to ask for until they see it. Clean cups, cloth for wiping grit from eyes, a little shade. She did not watch him more than she watched the others, but she did not practice ignoring him, either. It had become its own kind of honesty to see him as part of the structure of the day, a weight-bearer where weight needed bearing, nothing more, nothing less. The elder who had twice stopped at their fence now stood near the chalk line pegged in the grass, tallying measurements with the memory of a carpenter who has outlived most of his ladders. He saw the outsider and did not flinch. He pointed where an extra back would keep a beam true while the tenant seated, and the outsider went there without trying to make himself the story. Shortly after noon, the weather shifted its shoulder. A thick cloud rolled in low and mean from the west, carrying the kind of wind that wedges itself into every gap a man forgets to brace. Men lifted their eyes, made their small calculations, and did not hurry, which is different from being slow. They closed what could be closed, braced what could be braced, and called the boys off a scaffold with a tone that said there was no room now for proving anything. The father and the outsider were up on the southern sill, guiding a rafter into place with mallets and patience, when the gust that had been threatening all morning finally took its chance. It hit the face of the half-made frame like a hard hand, and the beam they were teasing into line kicked back and bucked, twisting the world into that suddenness where things begin to fall. The father's boot slipped on grain already polished by other boots, and for a sliver of time the scene held all the inevitability of gravity. The outsider did not shout. He dropped his mallet and drove his shoulder under the beam, not like a hero, but like a man who has learned how weight works and how to pay for it with the right part of his body. The rafter bit into his back, and he felt something give in the way deep under his scapula, a hot rip that meant the next day would be paid in stiffness. He stayed anyway, because staying was the difference between an accident and a story they would tell over bread with a quiet shake of the head. The father steadied, reclaimed the footing pride steals first, and together they rode the wood back into the notch. When the peg finally seated and the joint drew itself home, the wind spent a final breath and moved on to look for carelessness elsewhere. Down on the ground, the girl had felt the gust before she saw what it had done. She held her breath the way a field holds its breath before hail, and when the frame settled, she let the breath go slowly, making sure its release did not turn into a sound that would make a moment heavier than it needed to be. The outsider came off the scaffold with steps that were careful for new reasons. He did not make a show of pain. He carried it the way a man carries a sack he doesn't want someone else to pick up. Close to the ribs, eyes down, hands available. The elder's gaze, which had the accuracy of a plumb bob, took in the set of the outsider's shoulder and the angle of the father's mouth, and when he spoke it was to the air as much as to any man. A frame that holds in wind holds better when the wind is gone. No one asked if the outsider wanted to sit, offering a chair in front of a dozen men whose muscles were also talking would have turned gratitude into spectacle. Instead, the girl brought a strip of clean cloth, a handful of willow bark boiled down earlier for aches that come with haying, and set both on the bench where any man could take them without being seen. A minute later the cloth was gone, and the bitter medicine had left a clean circle in the cup. She did not look to see who had taken them. Some kindnesses don't need witnesses to count. The storm blew past with the shallow attention of weather that prefers to threaten rather than commit, and the work went on with the productive silence that follows something that might have been disastrous and was not. Afternoon light returned, hard and honest, and the frame began to resemble a place where winter could be faced with dignity. The outsider found himself assigned, without ceremony, to the pegging crew that climbed and settled and climbed again to set joints the way one sets a series of promises, squarely, with force enough to matter, but not enough to split. The father glanced at him now, and then the way a man glances at a tool he trusts, to confirm it is still where he placed it, to confirm it will answer when called. The girl moved among tables that came and went like tides, replenishing bread from baskets, pouring coffee that eddied with steam, clearing plates without attention, and therefore with perfect attention. At one point a neighbor's child wandered too close to the sawhorses, where spare timbers waited for assignment. The outsider stepped down, placed himself between the child and the horse with a presence so unassuming the boy changed direction without even knowing why. It was a small act, the smallest of the day, and yet it made its own entry in the ledger she kept where no one could see it. Toward evening, when shadows lengthened and the new barn had the look of a body ready for skin, a wagon wheel collapsed at the edge of the yard with the resigned groan of old iron giving up a last pretense. The wagon's load slid and caught, but a corner dropped hard onto the gravel, pinning the foot of the 13-year-old who had learned about rivets the day before. He did not cry out. He made that tight sound boys make when pain knocks, but pride tries to keep the door shut. Men turned, saw, measured. In a different world, someone would have reached for a phone, for sirens, for speed dressed as salvation. In this world, decisions moved through the elder's face first. The outsider arrived at the wagon within those rules, lowered a shoulder under the bed without taking authority that wasn't his, and looked for the father's eyes before he asked two men to lift with him. The father met his gaze, gave the smallest fraction of a nod, the kind you can deny later if someone accuses you of favor, and three backs took the weight, while a fourth slid the boy free. The foot was bruised and cut, not shattered, but the pain made the boy's mouth white. The girl brought water, clean and plain, and the outsider stepped away as soon as the weight was off his hands, giving the circle back to the people to whom it belonged. He did not suggest a clinic. He did not pull a wallet as if authority could be purchased. He stood with his hands open and empty, ready if told to be ready, still if told to be still. The elders settled on a plan older than attention spans. Cool water, elevation, watchfulness, a night of mother's eyes and men's checks. And if morning brought swelling that said bone, then they would decide on a drive into town with arrangements made the ordinary way. The father wrapped the foot with that same clean cloth that had disappeared earlier, and the boy's mother took his face between her hands and told him, with a look, that the story would be told later. But this moment was for breathing. The outsider felt the tug of his old life for a brief, embarrassing second, the remembered reach for a card that slid solutions across counters with the frictionless ease of money. The tug passed because he had already been taught what such ease costs in places where handshakes still matter more than signatures. He stepped back into work that did not require conscience to narrate itself, moving the wagon off the rutted edge, blocking the hub, checking the axle for surrender. The father joined him there, and for a few minutes they spoke the mechanical grammar that had become the safest way for them to understand each other. By the time the first stars shook themselves awake in the blue above the maples, the barn's frame stood proper, pegged and level, a declaration made in wood and skill that winter would find no cowardice here. The tables were cleared and folded with ritual neatness, tools returned to boxes and hooks, scraps gathered for the burned barrel, because leaving splinters in the grass is how feet get punished later by someone who did not sin. The outsider washed at the pump, a quieter man than he had been in the morning, which is to say a man who had traded a measure of certainty for a measure of belonging. The father approached with the stance of someone who has said thanks 1,000 ways and will now say it 1,001 without changing the shape of his mouth. He did not speak of debts. He spoke of the fence line to be walked next week, of a neighbor's baler that refused to time itself, of the way a roof keeps its promises when moss is kept from taking liberties. He named future tasks as if laying boards for another person to cross a stream without getting wet. The outsider understood the language under the language. He answered with the economy that respect prefers, agreeing only to what a man can carry without needing to boast about the weight. The girl stood in the doorway of the neighbor's kitchen, where women sorted dishes and laughter floated in that tired, grateful way it floats after danger has been turned aside by work. She watched the outsider speak to her father as if the two men had found a way to share ground without drawing lines in it. She did not see triumph in the outsider's shoulders. She saw fatigue and a steadiness that had been proofed by wind. The memory of the burned card did not soften. It did not need to. It had become the gate through which all of this had entered. Without that refusal, nothing honest would have followed. She held that in one hand, and in the other held the sight of a man who had climbed, carried, braced, and bent when bending was what the moment needed. Between those two weights, she found her balance. The house they would return to in the deepening dark, lamps lit, bread sliced, the day's dirt scrubbed from knuckles, felt no less theirs for his having stood near. That, more than any gesture, told her what mattered. The line she had drawn with flame had kept the shape of their life intact, and the work he had offered had fit inside it without pushing at the edges. When the night finally folded itself down and the road took the last of the wagons home, the outsider stood for a moment by his truck, looking not at the house, but at the barn silhouette against a sky full of patient stars. He put his hand against the cool metal of the door and then, as if remembering something he had decided to remember, he took his wallet from his pocket and set it on the seat. before climbing in. He did not need it here, and leaving it aside was a small discipline that helped hold the larger one. He drove away without spinning his tires in the gravel, and the sound of his departure stitched itself into the quiet the way a needle draws thread through cloth, firm but almost invisible. In the yard, the girl turned down the lamps one by one, the flame in each wick a reminder that control is not power, it is care. She lay down with her back still tired from carrying jugs, and her hands still smelling faintly of soap and willow bark. Sleep took her quickly, not as surrender, but as a promise that tomorrow would ask again for the same fidelity to small, right things, and that whatever the outsider chose to bring back would need to arrive the way it had learned to arrive, without noise, without shortcuts, and without the kind of glitter that turns a doorstep into a bargaining table. The seventh day began with a light rain that tapped on the porch roof and softened the edges of everything it touched, turning dust to darkened earth and sharpening the smell of pine where posts had been cut. The girl welcomed the rain as a kind of Sabbath for the fields, a pause that asked hands to move indoors, where smaller, quieter repairs waited their turn. She set herself to sorting jars, tightening the wire bales on lids that would soon hold peaches and beans, and she checked the pantry shelves the way a steward checks a ledger, counting not to hoard but to be honest with what winter would ask. The outsider arrived later than usual, had brim dripping, stepped slower, as if he had read the sky and matched it. He paused at the fence for a breath, then took the father's nod like a key and came through without splashing noise in the puddles that had formed in the wheel ruts. Today there would be no fence lines and no rafters. Rain presses people close to the work of maintenance. He took his place in the workshop under the lean-to, where the world smells like linseed and iron filings, and he set about truing a plane whose soul had bowed with years. The father worked beside him, flattening a warped shelf, the steady whisper of shavings landing like light snow. They spoke in that narrow band of conversation where information is enough and opinion is waste. The angle of a blade, the patience a knot requires, the way heat leaves a metal tongue when you have filed it right. The girl passed through with a basket of harness leather and left it without comment, and the outsider, understanding the grammar of that gesture by now, stitched and dressed what he found, hands remembering a teacher from his old life who had insisted that a repair is honest only if it disappears back into use. Mid-morning brought a different kind of weather. A man from the county with a laminated badge and a clipboard inside a clear sleeve. The kind of visitor whose shoes tell you he is not there to lift anything. He stood in the lane like an apologetic sign and explained that a road survey had decided the ditch along the eastern boundary did not meet the new drainage standard, that the culvert the community had set with their own shovels 3 summers ago would need to be replaced with a design the state preferred, and that right-of-way flags would go in next week ahead of a contractor whose trucks did not fit well on narrow roads. He used phrases that do not belong to Barnes: compliance window, fee schedule, variance process. The father listened without moving the set of his jaw and asked for the paper that would say these things again when the man had left. The girl watched the way authority tries to make itself sound like weather, inevitable and impersonal, and she felt that old ache in her chest where refusal and prudence argue. The outsider said nothing to the county man. He said nothing until the car had turned around carefully in the wet gravel and found its way back to the blacktop. Then he looked to the father and asked, not like someone proposing a fix, but like someone opening a door that could be closed without offense, whether he might be of use reading the pages that had been left. The father laid the stack on the bench, and the outsider translated the shape of the sentences into the shape of the choices, what could be negotiated and what could only be endured, where a drawing was a suggestion and where it was a verdict. He did not promise outcomes. He pointed at lines. He explained that a variance was not a favor but a petition. That petition required a map and a reason any man could agree with, and that men at desks are more likely to listen when the person making the case can show he has already done the simpler, cheaper thing well and for good cause. By noon a plan had been pinned to the wood with thumbtacks. The elder would ride into town with the father and the outsider to sit across from a clerk whose job was to turn large words into small stamps. They did not change clothes. They did not dress the trip as a performance. The girl wrapped bread and cheese in a clean cloth, and added 2 jars of water because the waiting room air in such places makes mouths dry with a different kind of thirst. At the township office, the outsider did what he had promised himself to do. He took a chair half a step behind the elder and the father, close enough for questions, far enough that no one could mistake him for their voice. When the clerk asked who was applying, the elder gave his name and the name of the road the way a person gives the title of a hymn. The outsider unfolded a map he had marked with pencil, not ink, and slid it to the elder's elbow without touching it again, and when a question came about runoff and freeze lines, he spoke exactly as much as was needed for the father to answer clearly, then went still. They made their case the way a barn is raised, each person putting a shoulder where weight needed it. No one climbing to the top, just a wave. The fee for filing the petition was printed on a sheet with all the warmth of rain on glass. The outsider felt the reflex in his fingers for the wallet he had left on his truck seat the night before, the learned convenience of being the man who solves the annoying part, and he left his hand where it was. The elder set cash down in careful bills that had been in an envelope under a flour tin, money folded from small sales and careful saving, and the clerk counted it twice, because that is what clerks do when life in envelopes meets life in drawers. When the last form had its square of approval and the copy had been slid under the glass, the father turned toward the door first, and the outsider followed, his role finished as invisibly as he had hoped. Rain held on through the afternoon like a sermon that runs long but true, and back at the farm there was work appropriate to a wet day. The girl brought out a wooden crate of dull knives and set them near the pump, and the outsider, shoulder tighter than he admitted after the barn gust, took each blade through the slow ritual of bringing back an edge that would not tear. Between strokes he set a kettle on to heat and mixed lye for soap, not because he had been asked, but because he had watched once and remembered, and he could tell that the barrel was running low. The father repaired the latch on the feed-room door, oiling a hinge that had complained so softly for so long that it had become part of the soundscape. Today, perhaps because weather had pushed everyone's attention into one room, the complaint felt like one too many. The elder stopped at the porch later than his usual time and left a sentence on the threshold the way men leave tools. The clerk had said the petition would be read at the township meeting, and if anyone wanted to speak not with heat, but with reason, it would be heard. He did not say who should go. He did not need to. The girl listened from the doorway where she had been setting jars, and she understood what the day had asked, that the outside world could be met without kneeling to it, that forms and stamps were not gods if a person refused to pray to them with panic. Evening brought another test, smaller and closer to the bone. The youngest child from 3 farms overwoke from his nap feverish and glassy-eyed, and a mother's walk to the lane told a whole story without words. In such moments, this community does not dramatize. It organizes. The elder would sit with the boy's father. The mother would pack a small bag with the simple things every visit requires, and someone would drive them to the clinic in town, because the old mare should not be asked to pull through rain cold enough to make breath smoke. The outsider stood near the hitching rail long enough for the father to look his way. One nod, and the truck door opened. He did not cross the threshold of the neighbor's house. He waited under the eave and carried the bag when it was handed to him. On the road he drove without commentary, without the music that used to keep him from hearing his own thoughts, without rushing to make his virtue visible in arrival time. He knew the way, and he knew which stoplight in town is always longer than it should be, and he kept a hand ready for the window crank so the cool air could be let in when the little boy's breath hitched. At the clinic doorway, he helped no one out of anything. He took the bag a second time, set it inside the door, and stepped back into the rain with the knowledge that the next decisions belonged to the family and to the nurse in white shoes, who would ask questions softly and quickly. He waited in the lot with the wipers thudding like a metronome and offered nothing to the vending machines, choosing instead to let the small hunger of worry do the work of prayer. When the door opened and the tired relief of parents came back into the wet evening, virus, fluids, watchfulness, the outsider was exactly where a man should be, where he said he would be. Engine steady, cabin warm. They returned to the farms in a darkness that was kinder than the afternoon had been, the rain worn down to a fine thread you could almost not feel. The girl had kept a lamp near the window until the truck lights brushed the hedgerow and turned the puddles to coins. She did not step out. She did not need to. The sound of the engine slowing in the lane, and then leaving again without lingering, told her the story's important parts. He had carried but not crowded. He had gone as far as usefulness allowed, and not one step more. And he had come back like a man who understands that some thresholds are not his to cross. She blew out the lamp and felt a quiet settle where anxiety had been rattling. The same way tools sound different on a bench once they have been put where they belong. The burned card was still the first page of this chapter in her life. A black square turned to ash to keep the shape of their days from being smudged. Yet all that had followed, the hinge, the belt, the barn, the petition, the drive, had written over that first page without erasing it, like careful script that respects the margin. She laid down with that knowledge in her hands and turned it like a smooth stone, recognizing its weight and its promise. The line she drew with fire had not ended the story. It had taught it how to walk. Tomorrow would come with its own weather, and if it brought sun or more rain or men with clipboards again, the answer would be the same as it had been since the first morning. Do the next right task, keep the tools clean, and let help in only through doors that leave the house standing. The 8th day rose clear, the rain of the previous night leaving the earth dark and rich, the air washed of dust. The girl stepped out onto the porch with her broom, as she always did, the boards still cool beneath her feet, the smell of damp soil carrying the promise of a good planting season. She swept with deliberate strokes, not out of habit alone, but because this was her way of beginning the day in order, ready for whatever it might bring. The outsider came not long after sunrise, walking the lane without hurry, his stride measured, the brim of his hat casting a shadow that hid most of his expression. By now, his arrival no longer felt like an interruption or a question. It was simply another thread in the fabric of these days, woven in carefully enough that it did not fray the edges. The father greeted him with a glance that held more weight than words could give, and the work began without ceremony, mending the gate to the pasture where spring calves would soon graze, cutting back the overgrowth near the creek so water could run its course without catching in roots. Side by side, they worked in the quiet rhythm that comes when two people have learned how to share a task without stepping on each other's ground. By midday, the sun was warm enough to dry the last of the puddles along the lane, and the farm moved with the ease of people who know the hardest part of the day's work is behind them. The girl set the table under the oak, the shade dappling the bread and the jars of fresh milk, and the outsider took his seat only after everyone else had found theirs. There was conversation, low, steady talk about weather patterns, about the calf born the week before, about the neighbor's daughter who had just announced her wedding, but none of it circled around him. That was the measure of how far things had come. He was no longer the center of a story, and that was exactly as it should be. After the meal, he rose and offered to finish the last of the trimming by the creek before heading back to town, and the father nodded in agreement. The girl gathered the plates, her eyes briefly meeting his as he passed. There was no message in the look, no invitation, no dismissal, just the acknowledgement of someone whose place in the day's work had been earned the hard way. As evening drew in, the light turned gold over the fields, catching on the wire of the fence they had mended together weeks before. The outsider loaded his tools into the back of his truck, closing the tailgate softly so as not to break the peace of the hour. He turned to the father, offering a firm handshake and a quiet word of thanks, not for the work itself, but for the space to do it. Then, without glancing back at the porch, he walked to the driver's side, started the engine, and eased the truck down the lane. The girl stood in the doorway, the smell of supper drifting from the kitchen, watching the dust settle where his tires had been. The black card he had once left on those very boards was long gone, reduced to ash in memory, but the lesson it carried had only grown clearer. Respect is not bought, it is built, and trust is not a gift, it is a daily choice. She stepped back inside, closing the door softly, certain that whatever came next for him, or for her, would be measured by the same rule she had held from the start. If you followed the story to its end, you understand how small choices shape the biggest changes, and how the quiet strength of a boundary kept can transform everything around it. This channel exists to bring you stories like this, rooted in truth, rich in meaning, and told with the care they deserve. Make sure you subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. And join us in keeping alive the kinds of stories that remind us all of what truly matters.